The list was supposed to create pressure. Instead, it revealed weakness. That is the simplest way to understand what just happened between Washington and Ottawa. 5 demands from the United States: dairy, digital media, government procurement, alcohol restrictions, energy on paper. It looked like a familiar Trump-era pressure sequence: build leverage, target pressure points, make the other side bargain from fear, and turn a trade review into a renegotiation. But when the list landed, Canada did not respond the way Washington expected. Carney did not split the package. He did not soften the disagreement. He did not turn 1 or 2 demands into symbolic concessions just to keep the wider process moving. He rejected all 5, and that is what changed the atmosphere, because the real shock was not that Canada said no. The real shock was that every demand ran into a structure Ottawa had already started hardening before the demands were formally laid down. That is the story. The United States thought it was applying pressure to a dependent system. Instead, it discovered that the system had already begun preparing itself against exactly this kind of pressure. And once you see that, this stops looking like a trade dispute and starts looking like something bigger. A struggle over whether North America will remain organized around American coercive centrality or begin drifting toward a looser, more hedged, more sovereignty-focused model. Start with energy, because energy is the quiet foundation under everything else. The United States imports roughly 3.8 million barrels of Canadian crude a day. That is around 23% of American refinery feedstock. And because Gulf Coast refineries are configured around Canadian heavy sour crude, this is not the kind of relationship you replace quickly with a policy memo and a threat. Add New England's winter dependence on Canadian electricity, and the picture gets even clearer. The energy relationship is not some generous Canadian service. It is a structural necessity inside the American system. That matters because once one side needs the other side in ways that cannot be rapidly rewired, every other demand begins operating under that shadow. Washington can threaten broadly, but Ottawa knows the United States cannot push everywhere at once without colliding with its own dependencies. That is the hidden leverage. Now move to dairy, where the American argument sounds strong until you understand the political terrain underneath it. Yes, Canada's supply management system is protectionist on paper. Yes, tariffs beyond quota are extremely high. And yes, American producers have complained for years. But those complaints collide with 2 facts. First, supply management stabilizes domestic production and protects politically vital farming blocks, especially in Quebec. Second, Canada has now moved beyond defending that system rhetorically. It has hardened it legislatively. That changes everything. What used to be a bargaining chip is no longer just a negotiator. As choice, it has been shifted into law. And once a pressure point is embedded in law, it stops behaving like a negotiable concession and starts behaving like a structural wall. The same pattern shows up in digital media. Washington says Canada's streaming and online news laws discriminate against American platforms by forcing them to reinvest revenue into Canadian content and compensate local publishers. That is one reading. Canada's reading is very different. Ottawa sees this not as discrimination, but as cultural self-defense in a market dominated by American platforms and American content gravity. And that means the issue is not only about revenue, it is about who gets to shape the content pipeline of a country sitting next to the largest media machine in the world. Once the dispute becomes about cultural sovereignty rather than pure market access, the probability of concession drops sharply. Now look at procurement, where Washington's case is even weaker. The United States wants more access for American firms to provincial contracts in Canada, but the U.S. itself relies heavily on domestic preference systems. Buy American is not a slogan. It is a governing philosophy. It shapes military procurement, infrastructure spending, and federal contracting. So for Canada to abandon domestic preference while the United States keeps its own would not feel like reciprocity. It would feel like unilateral exposure. That is why Carney's refusal here was almost built into the structure. Now take the alcohol dispute, which looks minor until you notice the sequence in Canadian provinces restricted American beer and wine. After U.S. tariffs hit Canadian goods, that means the Canadian move was retaliatory, not original. So when Washington asks Canada to lift those bans while its own tariffs remain, it is not really negotiating. It is asking Ottawa to stop responding while the original pressure remains in place. That is not a trade-off, that is compliance, and this is why the demand was rejected so quickly. Then there is the silence around autos, and that silence may be the loudest part of all. Autos were not the public centerpiece of the demand package, even though everyone involved knows the North American auto sector is the most deeply integrated industrial system on the continent. Parts cross the border multiple times. Plants on each side depend on the other side. Efficiency depends on the system functioning as one organism. Washington was careful here for a reason. Push too hard in autos and you hit your own manufacturers almost immediately. That is why the sector stayed largely outside the frontal demand structure. Not because it is unimportant, but because it is too important to weaponize carelessly. That is what makes this moment so revealing. Each demand was supposed to expose Canadian vulnerability. Instead, each one exposed American constraint. Dairy ran into law, digital media ran into sovereignty, procurement ran into hypocrisy, alcohol ran into sequence, autos ran into integration, energy ran into dependence. Once you map the full pressure tree, the meaning of the rejection changes. It is no longer just defiance. It is a sign that Canada believes Washington's room to escalate is narrower than Washington wants to admit, and that belief did not come from nowhere. Ottawa had already started preparing the system before the review point became public theater. That is the real turning point, not the rejection itself, the preparation behind it. Canada had already begun locking in policies, reinforcing domestic procurement, strengthening provincial, federal coordination, and expanding alternatives. That is why the response felt so immediate. It was not improvised, it was waiting, and the diversification piece matters enormously. For decades, nearly 75% of Canadian exports went to the United States. That kind of concentration creates caution. It creates the habit of accommodation. It trains policymakers to ask first how to preserve access, not how to widen options. But that older model has started to loosen agricultural openings with China, deeper positioning toward Europe, domestic redirection of spending toward Canadian suppliers, a stronger strategic focus on critical minerals, more coordination between Ottawa and Ontario on future-facing sectors. These things do not replace the U.S. market. They do not need to. They only need to reduce fear. Enough to let Canada say no without feeling that every no is existential. That is a huge change. It means the country is no longer bargaining from pure dependence. It is bargaining from managed exposure, and that is why Carney's rejection matters so much. It signals that the fear barrier has moved. The Davos speech made the political version of that shift visible. Countries not seated at the table end up on the menu. That line resonated because it translated a trade and sovereignty problem into a wider geopolitical grammar. It positioned Canada not as a dependent subordinate trying to preserve bilateral privileges, but as part of a wider camp of middle powers trying to resist economic coercion before it becomes the normal language of global order. Washington dismissed that as theater. But the reaction elsewhere suggested something different. Canada was starting to look less like a dependent neighbor and more like a country trying to become structurally harder to squeeze. Now look at the contradiction inside Washington, because this is where the pressure starts folding back onto itself. Trump talks like the deal may not matter, but his own trade representative lays out detailed conditions for extending it. Greer cites hundreds of billions in trade and huge export growth under the agreement. American industry groups push for continuity, not rupture. Those things do not line up with the story that the agreement is expendable. And that is what makes the pressure so revealing. The more Washington pushes, the more clearly it shows how much is at stake inside its own industrial base. Energy, autos, agriculture, steel, aluminum, lumber. The pressure is supposed to project dominance. Instead, it keeps disclosing dependence. That is the inversion at the center of this standoff. And once a weaker side realizes the stronger side cannot escalate cleanly across multiple critical sectors without injuring itself, the bargaining environment changes. That is where we are. Now moving toward a review point with three broad paths in front of us: full extension, withdrawal, or annual reviews that stretch uncertainty all the way toward 2036. That third option will tempt people because it sounds moderate. It is not moderate. It is structural corrosion. Annual uncertainty is poison for investment in sectors that need years of planning: autos, energy, industrial manufacturing, critical minerals. If the system shifts into annualized tension, capital decisions get distorted, supply chains start hedging, and the very integration the agreement was built to protect begins to fray. And here's the deeper irony. If Washington keeps using pressure this way, it may accelerate exactly the diversification it says it wants to stop. Every new threat gives Ottawa another argument for building alternatives. Every new review cycle gives Canada another reason to move capital inward and exposure outward. Every unresolved demand strengthens the domestic case that flexibility is now safer than dependence. That is the larger shift. This is not just about whether Canada rejected 5 demands. It is about whether North America is entering a new phase in which Canada is no longer willing to trade sovereignty for short-term calm and no longer believes that access to the U.S. market must be preserved at any political price. If that is true, then this list did something far bigger than create a standoff. It exposed a transition from accommodation to hardening, from dependence to managed leverage from bargaining under fear to bargaining under preparation. That is why this moment matters. Not because of the list by itself, not even because of the rejection by itself, because the rejection may have revealed that the old North American hierarchy is beginning to loosen at the structural level. And once that starts happening, the next round is never just another trade dispute. It is a fight over what kind of economic order the continent will live under after fear stops working the way it used to.